Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Asher Marketing Podcast. Tonight, our guest is Heather Herron. Heather, thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you for asking.
Heather, you and I go further back than I remembered. We were talking before we started recording, and our kids actually went to preschool together. Is that correct?
I remember seeing you at pick up and drop off, and then different elementary schools, but kind of came together then again in high school.
Yeah, so, kind of following the same path. And your girls are now at Miami of Ohio, and you have two girls at the same college. So what's that like?
So awesome. Didn't really plan it that way, but I'm so thankful it turned out that way. They're just 1 year apart in school, and so it would have been really challenging if we'd had them at different colleges. They've become closer. They're better friends now because they have each other there, and so it's been really fun, as you know, watching them grow into young adults.
Sure, watching them kind of do their own thing, and even despite the trying times we're in, make their way and figure out the world. It's nice that we had the opportunity to help them do that, but it's nicer when they're doing that on their own.
That's exactly right. Now if we could just get them off the payroll.
Yeah. Well, that day is hopefully coming soon.
Yes.
Well, thanks again for being here. As you know, on this podcast, we really talk about three things. One is your career path, and you have a really interesting career path, so I'm looking forward to hearing about that. You work for a very interesting organization in Sweetwater. We'll talk about that. And then from, the standpoint of what a lot of other marketers and people who are in communication and PR like to hear about are some of the things you're working on. So we'll focus on those three things, do a quick hit version of that, the speed round of the show as I always call it, and then your work here will be done. So career path, I knew you, of course, when you were at News Channel 15, you were an anchor there and you were in that spot for quite some time. But tell us a little bit about how you got into that spot and why you decided to do something different.
Sure. So I am one of those lucky kids who knew at about the age of 14, I wanted to get into broadcasting. I wanted to do news. I love to write. I'm a naturally curious person. And so I knew journalism was going to be my path. I just didn't know if it was going to be newspaper or radio or TV. So I started working in radio actually when I was 16.
Really? Was there someone who you wanted to emulate? Someone who was like a hero?
I have a great story I can tell you later about. It was Jane Pauley.
Okay, all right.
An Indiana girl, and she was the host of the Today Show. That's who I grew up watching.
Sure.
And so I really did kind of model my early ideas after her.
Okay.
And so I was in radio for several years, got into the telecommunications program at Ball State, which is one of the greatest in the Midwest, if not the country. And it was right after David Letterman had infused a bunch of money into that.
And David Letterman had Jane Pauley on a show all the time, so it all comes together,
And so I went to Ball State and then did an internship my senior year at Channel 33 here in Fort Wayne. Mm-hmm. And immediately got hired out of the internship. I was actually reporting during the week, and then I actually did weekend weather.
Really?
And I have no science background. I have no desire. I'm not good at science, but that was the position that was open.
Yeah. And David Letterman once did weather.
Right,
so again, it all comes together,
And Greg Schaub, who was the chief meteorologist there at the time, kind of took me under his wing and said, I can teach you enough, just to get by. I only did that for 3 months. And then the anchor position opened. So I took over that position.
When was that, Heather? Because I moved to Indiana in like 1994.
Yes.
And it was around that time.
It was in 94, exactly.
Okay.
Yes. And I graduated in 94, got the job immediately after college, and then very unexpectedly got a job offer from Grand Rapids, Michigan. And, it's a small business. It's a big business, but it's small and people are very connected. And so it was the same, the company owned Wayne TV here in Fort Wayne and also owned Wood TV, which was in Grand Rapids.
Okay.
And so through some connections, they found out about me and said, do you want to come to Grand Rapids? I had never been to Grand Rapids. I had to get a map out, figure out where it was. And I grew up in Indiana. I grew up, 10 minutes outside of Muncie, and this was home. And I thought, I don't want to go, but I thought, I have to go. I have to really seize this opportunity. So I was 22 years old when I took the job in Grand Rapids, and it's the 37th largest TV market. Okay. Way in over my head, but I never let on that was the case, and just soaked it up, learned everything I could learn while I was there, and was very happy there. Went as a reporter initially, and then while I was there, got promoted to weekend anchor, and was very happy there. I met my husband there, and we had both of our girls. And actually, because of 9/11, the story's becoming long, and I apologize.
No,
but,
this is what we do, yes.
Because of 9/11 is how I ended up back in Fort Wayne.
Okay, so explain that. So
yes.
how did that lead to you come back?
So all of the news directors were gathered at a convention in Nashville
Okay.
when the planes
Wow.
hit. So
Wow.
they were stranded. They were,
Wow.
grounded there. And so the company that owned us had stations all across the country. We had one in Indianapolis, one in Fort Wayne, and then Grand Rapids. So the news directors got together, rented a car, and said, we've got to get home. It's the biggest news story of
sure.
our lives. We
Yeah.
need to get back to our newsrooms. And coincidentally, I was on maternity leave. I had just had our second daughter. And so in the course of the drive back, the news director at Wayne said to the news director at Wood, I've been looking for a main female anchor for a while. I haven't been able to find anybody. Is there anybody kind of in our network? And she said, you know what? My weekend anchor is from Indiana originally. She worked in Fort Wayne for a short time.
Yeah.
Maybe she'd be interested.
Yeah.
And so they called me, and I
Yeah.
said, are you kidding?
Yeah.
I have a 21-month-old and a newborn.
Yeah.
I'm very happy here. We owned a house, and my husband said, wait a minute, let's think about
Yeah.
this. It was never on my radar to come back to Fort Wayne, and ended up really being such a blessing.
Yeah.
And I spent over 17 years on the air at Wayne.
Sure,
So,
sure.
Again, not in my plan,
Yeah.
but I kind of believe that it was meant to be.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things we've talked about with, I think, just about everyone who's been on the podcast so far is how relationships ultimately get you where you want to go. If those two people had never talked in the car, you'd never be where you are today.
It's weird to think about.
Yeah, for sure. So the news business is from the outside looking in seen as a glamorous business. And, now that I know a lot of folks, including you, who have worked in that business, it's a lot of really early mornings and a lot of stress. What was that experience
A
like?
lot of late nights and
Yeah.
weekends. And you know what? I never complained about it or saw it as being drudgery because I really loved it,
Yeah.
honestly. I was doing what I had always dreamed
Sure.
of doing. And so I was one of those, especially when I was younger and single. I mean, I jumped at every chance to work.
Sure.
You need somebody to anchor on the holiday, sign me up.
Yeah.
I just really wanted that experience.
Sure.
And so I never minded the work. Now, I will say, and especially now having been out of the news business for 2.5 years, I didn't fully appreciate how negative it can be because of not only the news itself being negative, but
Sure.
just the grind of the hours and the, people moving into the market and moving out of the market. It really, but again, I don't say that to complain.
Sure. Just the reality of it.
It
Yeah,
is.
it's a tough job. It really is.
And it has, as you know, it has evolved immensely since I started. I like to joke to the younger reporters that we were hiring that Google didn't exist when I was first a reporter.
Sure.
And so gathering news was very, very different.
Yeah.
And, in a good way,
Sure.
I think, really learning how to make connections with people
Yep.
and network and really dig for stories.
Sure.
And I felt like, especially in those early years, what we did mattered. The journalism was pretty noble at one time.
Sure.
And it can still be,
Yeah.
but it has changed.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm sort of from the old school, this is going to make me sound like a dinosaur, but the Walter Cronkite school where,
Sure.
that's the authority and that's the person you look up to and it's the voice of trust. And, that's been a challenge lately. Is there anything, with the year that 2020 has been, has there ever been a moment when you've said, boy, it would be fun to be in, the journalism world? Or you're kind of like, I'm really glad that I'm not there.
I get asked that a lot.
Yeah.
And really, I'm thankful that I'm not.
Yeah.
Again, I think now, having stepped away from it, and realizing just how mired in things you become, and I didn't fully appreciate that.
Yeah.
And so, immediately when the pandemic happened and the shutdown happened, I was back in news mode and I was
Yeah,
watching every
sure.
newscast and
Sure.
I really started to realize, I need to step away from this.
Yeah.
And I hadn't had the ability to do that for so many
Oh,
years.
sure. Well, I would imagine, being a news anchor in Fort Wayne, which is a big, small town,
Right.
you get recognized everywhere you go. And that's, in some days that's probably great, and some days it's probably not so great.
Yeah, and again, I always saw it as a blessing because if I was out in public and people didn't recognize me,
Yeah,
I would
there'd be
have
something
trouble.
wrong. Yeah. For
but
sure.
yes, you're right. There did come that extra level of kind of fishbowl living, if you will. And I still get it. I mean,
Sure.
I don't know how long it will last, even now after being out of the business for a while. But I always very much appreciated it. But on the other hand, it did feel, like a fishbowl.
Yeah, for sure.
That people could see every flaw.
Sure.
And I think that was challenging for my kids even.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Growing up, that everybody knew who their mom was.
Yeah,
And there was
no short trips to the grocery store.
Right.
Yeah. So let's talk about what you're doing now and how you got there. So Sweetwater is obviously a very recognizable name, and you made that change, was it like a year and a half, 2 years ago?
It was May of 2018.
May of 2018. Okay, so yeah, about a year and a half ago. How did that happen, and why did you decide to make such a big shift?
Again, it happened without any planning.
Yeah.
And which is why I do sort of, if you believe in fate or timing or a God thing, I really had been thinking, what would my life look like if I wasn't doing television?
Yeah.
And that was primarily out of many conversations that I had with my husband about, okay, our kids are almost grown. I work nights, he works days, and we were really great parenting partners in that respect because one of us was home with the kids. But I thought they're going to be gone. We're going to be empty nesters and living in the same house, but
never seeing each other.
Yeah, very parallel lives. And I thought, gosh, that's not really what I want. We needed to reconnect. So I began to think, what would I do and what would that look like? But never really acted on it because I kind of got this in my head of this is all I know how to do and it's all I'm good at and I have no skills that are transferable. Well, now I realize how short-minded that was.
And probably everyone else could see it, but you couldn't, as is true for most of us.
Most of us.
Yeah.
And so, it happened out of the blue. I got a call from one of the executives at Sweetwater and said, we have somebody retiring. We kind of want to revamp the position. Do some things differently. Do you think you'd be interested in having a conversation with us? And the timing was just perfect. It was a few months from my contract being up.
Yeah.
And so it worked out, and it's I've never looked back.
Yeah, so tell us what you're doing at Sweetwater these days. It's a communication role, it's an executive role, but what exactly does the work look like?
Yeah, it's kind of all over the place, which is what I love. So my title is Vice President of Corporate Communications, but that doesn't begin to tell you what I do.
Sure.
So a good chunk of my job is community outreach and the philanthropy side of it. And as you know, Chuck and Lisa Zurak are incredible philanthropists in this community. And so I work closely with them on things that they're supporting, organizations that they're donating money to.
Yep, very invested in programs with music and youth, and not just that, but that's a focus.
And reinvesting in Fort Wayne and the community. So that's a lot of fun, and I get to work on the opposite side now with people that I knew, in my news role, but we get to work with them very differently. So that's a lot of fun. The other part of it is really communications. So I take care of all of the internal communications. We do a company-wide newsletter once a month, and so I concentrate on that. And then the most exciting thing that we've done since I joined was engaging with a PR firm. Okay. And really ramping up our efforts. Everybody in Fort Wayne knows who Sweetwater is. If you're a musician, you probably know who Sweetwater is, but we are really best in class in so many areas in terms of technology, culture for sure. And so we really felt like there's a story out there that needs to be told. And Chuck, his story by itself, starting the company in the back of a Volkswagen bus, it's such an authentic story to tell. Yeah,
well, I want to hear a little bit about how you define Sweetwater to people either who know it on the surface but don't know the details, or who don't know it at all, because it seems like it's one of those overnight sensations that was 30 years in the making.
That's exactly what it is.
So tell me a little bit about the Sweetwater story from your perspective.
Sure. So Chuck really started it literally in the back of a Volkswagen bus. Started as a studio. He's a musician, an engineer, and he would travel around to venues and string cable and record things. And got into the retail side of it several years later, working with a machine called the Kurzweil K250. And it was really cutting edge back in the early 70s. And that's what started the retail side of it. And Chuck is such a visionary. And so jumped on the e-commerce bandwagon before it was a bandwagon, and began the e-commerce side of our business, and that's what has led to the success of today.
So sort of the Jeff Bezos of the music world.
Yes, you can think of that. And we do have a retail. We have one brick and mortar location that's here in Fort Wayne, but the bulk of our business is all done online or on the phone.
Yeah. So the phrase, was it the Bezos Z250?
The Kurzweil.
Kurzweil.
Yes.
See, yeah. So did you have any music background, or was this all language you had to learn?
No, I've had to learn it all. In fact, they asked me that initially. Do you play any instruments? Because I mean, I would bet probably 80% of the people there are musicians. It's such a creative place. No, I have no musical background.
Okay.
I've learned it all. Good thing, I'm a quick study, and so I've really embraced it and absorbed it.
That's where the news background comes in, so you have to know a lot about, you have to know a little about a lot of different things, Yeah, so Sweetwater is, primarily an e-commerce retailer. It has a brick and mortar location. How do you define the size of Sweetwater? Because it's a big place and it's grown exponentially, but how do you, when people ask you how big is the entity, how do you define that?
Yeah, it's really hard. We have over 1,800 employees just there on the Sweetwater campus.
Wow.
That does not include any of our Sweet family businesses, which I should mention, I also do PR for all of those.
Okay, so this is
Sweet
aviation,
and Sweet Helicopters and Launch Optical, all of those. So we call those our Sweet family of companies. And so not including those, we have about 1,800 employees on campus. We have I want to say 163 acres, I think that's right, up on the northwest side of Fort Wayne. It's really become its own kind of campus. There's no other way to say it. We have really designed things to make it easy to work there so that you can combine work and life. Chuck, again, being a visionary, is very aware of culture and has worked really hard to create that. And that's been a challenge as we've grown so quickly in the last few years to maintain that. But it really is a family business. He's the sole owner along with his wife, and they really stress that.
So what role do you have, if any, in being part of shaping culture in employee recruitment? Because from a PR standpoint, people always think about external PR, but a big piece of it is sort of reinforcing the culture internally. Do you play any role in that?
Yeah, I work very closely with our human resources team. We have a relatively new position called the Chief People Officer, and he oversees all of our HR. And that, again, we've been really focusing on efforts to attract people and then to retain them. And, it can be challenging because people are like, for what?
For sure.
Especially musicians who've been in bigger cities. And so we've worked really hard to get them here, and then once they're here, to really engage them in the community. They get plugged in with other musicians, trailing spouses, that's really important to us.
For sure.
So we do have a lot of initiatives in place that are geared toward communicating, what a great place it is to the families of those workers as well. We have a Facebook page, Sweet Home Indiana, that's for spouses and employees.
Well, and you and I know what a great place this is to raise kids. So, and we're both transplants, me from a different state, you from a little bit closer, but still. So I think it's easier to tell that story when you've lived it and when you have that experience. So,
absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the stuff you work on. We talked about how your title doesn't quite say what you do. You mentioned some of the things you work on, but what are some of the big projects or the things that are either keeping you up at night or making you excited, or maybe both at the same time? What are some of those projects that are on your plate right now?
So I mentioned that big PR effort. We hired a PR firm about 6 months after I got there. I did a lot of the vetting, and we brought them on, and we've never done that before. Typically we hire within. We don't use consultants. Because it is such a unique story and a unique culture. And so this was the first time that we'd done that. And it didn't go well. It was, we learned a lot from that experience, but didn't end up sticking with that firm for very long.
If you don't mind sharing, without obviously naming names, this isn't 60 Minutes, so I won't put you on the spot too much, but what were some of the things that maybe didn't meet expectations or didn't go as well as you expected?
I think it was on both sides. I think we didn't know enough about what to expect while we were searching for a firm, and I think they didn't fully understand us. Which, you really kind of have to be immersed in the culture on a daily basis to get the DNA
Sure.
of who we are and what we do. And so it just never really clicked. I also think that we made some mistakes in hiring. We went with a bigger firm that had a great reputation and a big name, thinking that they would have some connections for us.
Sure.
We ended up being, a really small client
Sure.
for them. And so in the second round, when we were doing our second search, we knew what kind of questions to ask.
Yep.
And really found a firm that we have just connected with right from the very beginning. And they've done a phenomenal job for us. So that was a huge learning experience.
Yep.
So some of the projects I don't know if you saw recently, we had an article in Forbes and CNN Business. Those have been some big wins for us in just getting the Sweetwater name out. But we're working on lots of little things, podcasts, and having our executives really be thought leaders in whatever it is that they're doing, whether it's culture or the HR side of it, the tech side of it, the e-commerce side of it.
Sure.
And so we've really been able to leverage just the immense knowledge, the brain trust that exists at Sweetwater, and use them to tell our story.
Sure.
So those are the kind of things that we're working on. We have some big plans for 2021. Some of the things that we had hoped to do this year, because of COVID, didn't happen.
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm sure one of the ways that the company connects to the community in more typical times is through events, through concerts and things that went away. So how is that changing your world, and what are you trying to do to kind of bridge that gap, if anything?
Yeah. Well, we're lucky because we're in a position where we do help live musicians and we do host live events. But on the other hand, we still have all of the gear and all the things that you need if you own a studio. So what we really found early on was that because all of the live events were canceled, musicians were able to write and be able to kind of hunker down in their studios. So they needed to upgrade some of their gear. And they came to us and said, I want to work on this project now. I have all this time that I didn't have because I've been on the road and now I'm quarantined at home. So we just were able to provide, the same service to them, just in a different way.
To build out a home studio, a mini home studio, so they could do, a live broadcast and all that.
Yes,
that's great.
And we found too, educators, colleges, people had to pivot very quickly to virtual, learning. So we've sold a lot of podcast equipment, people who are home, computers and interfaces and things like that people are using to communicate remotely.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that I think is there's a lot of bad things coming out of this, but one of the good things is I think there is a lot of innovation. I mean, I know that obviously working in this industry, I had to say, okay, different time, what do I need to be doing differently? And tried to get somewhat good at video, tried to get somewhat good. We started a podcast as a result of it, which you're now proud of. So I think that innovation, it kind of pushed things in a direction that they were headed in anyway. And it's good to see Sweetwater pivoting in that direction.
Yeah, and we were really fortunate. We broke ground a year and a half ago on our new warehouse. And we literally moved into it just weeks before the mandated shutdown. The good thing is we had sort of anticipated having this extra space, so we had a lot of extra inventory already in the building and in the pipeline through our supply chain, anticipating that we'd have this extra space. We didn't know, of course, that the COVID was going to happen, but it set us up perfectly so that when it did hit, we had the gear to sell. Now, obviously, we had to shift to some remote working. Those were some challenges that we had early on. Initially, we sent the workers home in the distribution center. So that meant that members of the executive team, Chuck himself and his family, were literally in there packing boxes to make sure that that things were still running.
Kind of going back to his roots there for a second. Yeah. So anything else that's on your plate that you're working on, or anything else, project-wise that you think is compelling or interesting?
Yeah, and I work closely with the marketing team, even though what I do is not your traditional marketing. But I do work closely with them and the initiatives that they're working on, and so I'm just always kind of in the background, listening and learning about how we are doing our marketing to our customers, how we market, B2C and B2B. And so from that standpoint, I've learned a lot because I don't have a marketing background. Mine is purely in communications and PR.
So I'm going to pivot myself to the 3 quick hit questions that we ask to kind of summarize everything we've talked about. And one is about career path, one is about your organization, and then the last is a little bit of a wild card. It's advice for your peers. Well, let's start with the career path question. So you've had an interesting career. You've made a big change. If somebody were to ask you, whether it was, one of your daughters starting a career, if it was someone looking to start in journalism, if it was someone in journalism looking to go somewhere else, what's your one best piece of career advice?
I have lots of advice to give. I'll just relate this one story, and I was making the transition from 30 years in broadcasting to this new career. Yeah. In a new place where I didn't know anybody, at the same time that my older daughter graduated from high school and was getting ready to leave to go to college. Yep. And she, had these few moments where she was sort of paralyzed with fear and the unknown, and it's scary. And she said, maybe I made the wrong decision going away from home. Maybe I should have stayed here. Maybe I chose the wrong major. Just, all of these things. And I said to her, well, what would you tell me? Because I'm nervous. I'm scared. Yeah. And I'm taking a leap. Yeah. And I'm 30 years older than you are, and I've never done anything else. So would you tell me that I should just stop, that I should stay somewhere where I'm not growing? And she said, why do you turn everything into a husband? So I guess to expand on that, I would just say, don't be afraid to take a leap. If it's what you really want and you have the drive, don't be afraid to do it. Yeah. There was a quote I heard the other day. Somebody said, if it scares you because it pushes you, then say yes. Right. And you'll probably have the energy and the motivation to do well by it. And if you don't, you can always do something else. That's exactly right. Yes. Yeah. So as far as Sweetwater goes, you did a great job of describing what Sweetwater is and some of the Sweetwater story. But if you had to concisely say, here's what we are and what we do, what is it that you'd focus on? We are a people company. And when I say people, I don't just mean all of our employees who are incredibly important to us, and we've done a lot, as I said, internally with culture and things like that, but we're all about people and relationships. And so all of our sales engineers, that's what they do. They build relationships with our customers to where they know their pet's name. Very early on in the pandemic, we made it a point to call our customers and just say, how are you doing? What are you doing? Yeah. Not trying to sell them something. Sure. And so it's really based on those relationships. And Chuck is very fond of saying, I'm in the business of helping people make their dreams come true. And that's really, at the heart of it, that's what we do. Yeah, that's a pretty fun job. Yes. Yeah, we talked about that here when the pandemic first kicked in because, the economy wasn't doing so well. And the discussion here was it's not a great time to try to sell something to people you don't know, but it is a great time to double down on the relationships that you probably should be focused on anyway. So great to hear that that's the focus there as well. All right, last question. So it's a challenging time for a lot of people. And, you have a lot of influence because you're a recognizable face. You get stopped in the grocery store and everyone else. If one of your peers, someone, was looking for some optimism, some words of hope, some guidance career-wise or otherwise, beyond what you already said about careers, what do you think is the silver lining ahead for us? What might you say to someone? Yeah, I think even though it has been incredibly challenging, you mentioned it's been a time for innovation and creation. And we are creating a whole new, population of people who are resilient. And so that's what I keep reminding people. Even though this is a tough time, we're going to look back at this and realize how much we grew. Yeah. And how much we were forced to innovate and be creative and pivot. We've used that word a lot too. Sure. And so I think that's what I'll take away from it, is just being able to look back and say, we did a really good job of kind of changing our thinking and thinking outside the box and being creative. Yeah, and to recognize that this isn't forever. While it might seem like it, there will be a better day ahead. But the decisions that we're making now are going to matter later. And so, recognizing that while this is very uncharted territory, we have some opportunities here to build and grow.
Sure, sure. And that could mean an entire career change, or it could just mean
Perhaps.
pushing out of your comfort zone. Well, Heather, it's great talking with you, and nice to sit down beyond passing each other a million miles an hour at a school event or seeing you on TV trying to condense the news. It's great to talk with you. Thanks for
You
being
too.
here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Asher Marketing Podcast, and we hope to see you then. Thanks.